The origins of the thoughts I'm going to share with you are related to a paper I wrote 2 or 3 years ago on the whole area of quantum risks. And there is at least a metaphorical relationship and correlation between the thoughts I put forward there as part of a different discussion and value. Value being in the eye of the beholder, how it's perceived, and what it means to different people at the same time across organizations. I just want to make sure that you can hear me okay, and my microphone and so forth, Mike.
Everything is going well, Peter.
Cool, excellent, okay. So Irish, we're kind of storytellers at heart, and I hope to be engaging and telling the story here of value and value at risk. And you might say, well, goodness gracious, what's Peader starting off with here? Peader's the Irish for Peter, incidentally, for those that want to know. This here is a representation of certainly multinational corporations today. This would be a small multinational corporation. It's also a representation of a small to medium-sized enterprise, given the way in which enterprises, be they large, multinationals, or even small. Because today, more and more organizations have, unlike when I was a boy, all organizations were vertically integrated. Everything was done in-house to get the product, the service out to the customer. Now, core processes are outsourced. Now, core functions are outsourced. And what is done inside the organization reflects to what is determined by those at the strategic level to be core to the business model, those things that we reserve to ourselves. And this here describes the mixed array of interrelationships, interconnections that are all required to work in harmony, a kind of a homeostasis, as it were, such that an organization can function, such that at the beginning of the year it starts its prosecuting its mission, and at the end of the year hopes to increase the value. What kind of value is the question then at the end of the year? So organizations today are more complex than they were in the past. In fact, quite a number of years ago, it was discovered first that when we look at let's say the S&P 500 and 1200, that the value of these enterprises today, and discovered back then, but now today for sure, that 90% plus or minus, 90% plus in lots of cases, of the total value of an enterprise now is comprised of intangibles, no longer comprised of inventory, buildings, cash in hand, and discounted cash and so forth. But there's a whole bunch of other things we cannot see, intangible things that now make up the entirety of the value of that enterprise. A lot of that value exists in these little gray lines between these dots here. And those dots in that picture there, just go back to it for a moment, also help us to understand that, for example, let us say a HR director in this node here, this asset, this building, this place, this entity, what he or she perceives as a risk or an opportunity, or as value creation or preservation, could be perceived differently by a person over here because of the different taxonomies. I don't mean just language, of course, but the different taxonomies, different units of measure, and so forth. So the world has got to a point now where the appreciation of value, the interpretation of value is changing. And there's a link here to people that want to download this and get it from ALN. There's a link here to the paper I wrote on quantum risks. And all I did here with this definition was I took a definition of a quantum particle and I simply used that term as a metaphor and added in across systems. Except in this case, we're talking about risks which exist in different states at the same time across different systems that can't be seen together. One person sees a positive, the other sees a negative. Just kind of hold that thought up there somewhere, right? And by the way, I try and be kind of Socratic in my thinking and storytelling. So I'm interested here in sharing ideas. I'm not interested in trying to present a point of view and saying mine is right. I'm interested in a conversation, a debate, such that together going forward, we can find, we've now got a strengthened understanding and so forth. Good, mature understanding. So I'm a member of a thing called the Value Commission. And the Value Commission was established by the Capitals Coalition. And they set up this project which required the creation of a commission. There are 34 commissioners within it. I'm one of the 34. And it's one of the pieces on the kind of global kind of chessboard where different groups of people are trying to construct an internationally proven and accepted body of knowledge on a range of things, from value accounting, impact accounting, and also to value. And what we are required to do is to produce an open source database of value factors such that organizations will be able to attribute value, for example, the social impact, the social cost of carbon and so forth, and different mixes of things that we've never been used to try to measure before. Might interest people to know that, for example, the International Federation of Accountants put out a white paper some 18 months ago, I think it was, on the whole idea of the perhaps change in title of a CFO, a Chief Financial Officer. That going forward, there could be a case, they've made the case, the International Federation of Accountants, that perhaps given the growth of intangibles, given the difficulty in perceiving what is and what is not value, that perhaps the Chief Financial Officer title should be changed from Chief Financial Officer to Chief Value Officer. Because if the smallest percentile of your assets are tangible, and we in the past have been used to parameterizing those in terms of dollar values, but now with the greater bulk of value and assets being intangible, how do you parameterize that? So the Chief Financial Officer had better be able to put parameters around these intangibles. So the Capitals Coalition, of which I'm part through the Value Commission, have discerned this definition of value, the importance, worth, or usefulness of a thing, very high level. And it's a piece of an overall kind of train of thought and thinking and process and methodology, such that we can understand, come up with internationally proven and accepted valuation criteria and the production of these value factors. So moving on from that, there's another piece to the jigsaw. I'm only covering a handful of these pieces. Mary Adams is a giant in the space of integrated thinking, and she's intimately familiar with this diagram here. And the link to the diagram at the top will bring you to the IIRC. This is a depiction of the value preservation kind of framework and model. Things I'd like to point out is, you'll notice there on the left, you got financial, manufactured, intellectual, human, social relationship. Social relationship means reputational, and natural, meaning kind of environmental. These, in fact, are capitals. Because today, if 90% plus of the value of a thing, of an enterprise, are intangible in nature, then clearly it stands that the value in our organization is no longer just capital value. There is, in fact, a stack of capitals like this, a stack of 6 capitals. Now, value, the Capitals Coalition would argue there are 4. It's all part of the debate, the dialectic. This mix of capitals that are used, allocated by ultimately the board, but constructed through initiatives and strategies put up by management and approved by board, are put through the business model, which is essentially what happens from input through business activities here, business outputs, and ultimately the outcomes. But the outcomes in the form of the change in the profile of the capitals different here from the input through to the output. And sometimes when you're making a decision to, for example, launch a new product because we need growth, because the alternative to looking for growth is to, metaphorically, putting the money under the mattress and hoping in 20 years' time it'll have the same value in 20 years' time as it has today. We all know that to be a ridiculous notion with inflation and so forth. So clearly we've got to do something with that money. We must put it to work. We must take a risk such that we would hope that the money today, the $100 today, becomes X, 100X at a future time. But to do that, we're going to have to put financial capital at risk so that we get, for example, maybe an increase in intellectual capital, an increase in human capital. And you have this kind of weaving through, this threading through of the use of capitals to achieve outcomes. So at a board level, at a strategic leadership level, and I'm one of the editors of a thing called ISO 37000, the governance of sustainable organizations. And I'm going to make reference to that very, very near the end of the thoughts I'm going to share with you. So all I've done so far is really just make people aware, if you're not already aware, apologize if you're already aware, that the world in the context of understanding parameterizing value is changing and risk is changing rapidly. And in ISO land, of which I'm a participant in both the governance technical committee and also the risk technical committee, we are in the risk side of the land, we're grappling with over 400 definitions of risk. And quite a challenge if ESG in particular, and today's method of understanding value of a total enterprise, if it's all about data, doesn't work, doesn't help to have 400 definitions from a data management perspective. Anyway, that's a different topic, different conversation. So now maybe having set the scene, as it were, if we just take a look at this here. Everything I've shared with you before, other than quantum risks, there are authoritative sources, independent, international authoritative sources that you can click into and research and so forth. From here on in now, I'm applying that to a proposition I'm making. And again, I'm not seeking to convince you that I'm right. I'm seeking to get into a discussion so that together we can improve the thinking and get to a better place. So what I'm presenting here is a notion that there is such a thing as a value at risk continuum, the thing that rests between these two lines here. And this kind of funnel, this continuum, is an overlay on an x-axis here and a y-axis here. The y-axis goes above the x and below the x, value creation above the x and value preservation below. Some people don't like this model, incidentally. They've said, why not play with a kind of a yin and yang where everything is above the x-axis? Perfectly fine. I'm not wedded to the visualization, just to the story of it. And we can improve on this visualization, I've no doubt. And then I'm talking about, okay, so now let's think in terms of decision making, where down here we have kind of operational decision making, and up here on the right, strategic decision making. When we're talking about value, we're talking about value in terms of the capitals that I referred to earlier on. And when we're talking about growth and advancement, we're talking about sustainable growth over time. So, and then of course, three kind of slices through the value continuum in the form of the kind of decision making that's made at the strategic level, bearing in mind the needs, the wants, the desires of stakeholders, because the day is gone as well, where shareholder capitalism is what it's all about. Now it's about stakeholder capitalism. The fact that there is a requirement for an equilibrium. It's not all about the money, as it were. If we're taking something out of the ground to create a product, but we're polluting the waters at the same time and injuring people, is the profit we're reporting at the end of the year real profit? Or is it subsidized by the damage we're doing elsewhere? So stakeholder capitalism. and stakeholder kind of purpose-driven thinking up here. And then in the middle strata, the operating performance, where most of us reside, that kind of operational strata. And finally, compliance and prevention. Now look, there could be maybe 5 slices here. These mightn't be the right kind of headings. Don't get caught into that. Just kind of follow the story, as it were. We could discuss later how we could improve on this. So if we start thinking, first of all, in terms of the easiest stuff to talk to, the whole area of decision making at the level of value preservation in day-to-day, stuff that we're well used to, quality assurance, systems compliance, regulatory compliance. For my day job, I work on the global ESG Practice Lead for a software company, the largest governance risk compliance platform provider globally, called Archer, just bought out of Dell EMC 2 years ago by a private equity house. You know, I think 80% of the Fortune 500 use 2 or 3 of our use cases. That's where I work, in the area of ESG, sustainability. Just by the way, to digress a bit, ESG, you've heard of it. These are metrics. Sustainability is a higher, more of a strategic thing. It's about giving our purpose. How can we, what ability do we have to demonstrate our viability and our performance over the longer term? Just as thought I'd share that. So right, down here, back to value preservation. The next kind of level up is the area of operational decision making. The value, these folk here were focused more on preservation of value. Here now, we're talking more about the short term. We're going through this rite of passage at the moment from short-termism, shareholder quarter-on-quarter short-termism, to thinking the longer term. That's what the proposed SEC rule is all about as well, in fact, in terms of ESG, you know, for the longer term good, for future generations, and that includes future stakeholders and so forth. So the kind of decisions that are made at this level, business issues, margin management, ESG impacts, continuity operations, things that if we don't get right every day, all the time, every day, we're going to have an erosion of value, destruction of value potentially. And then up here, thinking more at the level of the longer term. In ISO 37000, when we talk about the governance structure of an organization, of course, we're referring to the board of directors. But we also, within our guidance, talk about the thread of governance. Because it's not that the decisions are just made at the board level. Decisions are made at every level, from the boardroom, as it were, to the storeroom. And the ability for the purpose of the organization, the mission of the organization, the values that are meant to influence day-to-day decision-making, it should be possible to at least sense that thread from the boardroom to the storeroom through this thread of governance. So these folk here at the top have a very, very difficult challenge. Because in fact, if we think about it in our professional lives, at the level of value preservation, particularly in a production environment, for example, Six Sigma, we can measure things, we can master risks, master controls to a level of very high refinement. Because we have data, we have such mastery of controls, we think about risk and return in terms of any deviation from an expected kind of outcome. Lots of control here, lots of mastery here. However, the poor old folk in the boardroom, they don't have all that much data because we can't predict the future. AI can't predict the future. I don't like using the term prediction in the context of any use of AI because when I use my Spotify can pretty much pick the music I like to hear. But Spotify only has one variable, me, my taste. And so, of course, it can predict my taste in music. And that's what those AIs that they use will use. And I'm really disappointed because it knows my likes and my dislikes through my selections. I'm teaching the AI what I like and what I don't like. But the folk at a board level, looking forward, have an incredibly complex array of things to consider. competitive landscape, the regulatory landscape, the operational environments, all the things that can go wrong. And quite often, what's now understood is that propositions that require big, bold bets, decisions, that quite often, when we have these big, what we call value collapse events, right? There's a really good study done in the early noughties, I think it was, or maybe previous to that, by Booz, what was then Booz Allen Hamilton, on value collapse events. Back then, events that precipitated destruction of value in excess of $1 billion. So typically you'd have a commission, you'd have an investigation. What did they understand? What did they find out? What they found out was that the root cause of those big mishaps, those value destructive events, wasn't some financial issue, it was a financial consequence, but it was a strategic misstep on the part of the board, or some big operational thing that was operational and even tactical in nature, had a significant strategic impact. And that in retrospect, looking back, what happened was that most of the assumptions that people made decisions on, those assumptions weren't really tested. And quite often, it's a human thing, or species, assumptions very quickly tend to become kind of cast in stone, as though things we are certain will happen. Assumptions can be toxic. They can be very, very dangerous. But this speaks to the fact that the board, in making decisions looking forward, there's so many things to comprehend, no matter how good the quality of the data, the information that's made available to them. The reality is that they ultimately have to fall back on this human ability to make a decision. Now, we're getting close maybe to the whole question then of the existence of measurable uncertainties on the bottom here and unmeasurable uncertainties on the top here. So let's imagine, for example, the organization that decides we have to, in the interest of growth and fulfilling the needs of all of our stakeholders, they make a very, very significant investment. We're going to open a new facility in a different geography. We're going to invest so much in that facility, in that other geography. The strategic level decision makers, the governance level decision makers, when they make that decision, when they invest those hundreds of millions in a facility, in a campus or whatever, they're not entering into the property management business. They're doing that such that activities can take place. Think about the value creation model that I showed you earlier on. They're doing this so that things can happen within the facilities. I spent 4.5 hours last week with a top 4 accounting firm and their climate scientists and all that. We made a joint bid to a Fortune 100 organization. And we presented how they do the climate scenario analysis stuff. Information goes from there into our software and all that. And you end up looking at a number of different things. And one of those things, for example, would be an inventory of your assets, projected forward to an inventory of potentially stranded assets if weather changes. And one of the authoritative sources in that model that's built out to measure financial impacts is insurance, because there we will have a reference point for the financial value of a building, which is almost straight away poo-pooed. That's irrelevant. It's not the financial value of the building, it's what goes on within it. If it's not functioning, not of high resiliency, high integrity, all the operations flowing smoothly through it. And remember that initial diagram, this organizational blindness diagram, that node of that cog and the overall machinery of our business model and operating model can't function properly. Wow, our business model is hit under the waterline. Okay, so we get the notion there that the reason that folk up here will invest those hundreds of millions in facilities in one part of the world is of a different order of consideration, business model level, operating model level consideration. Understandably, the people that in facilities and so forth who are meant to mind these places, they're looking at the perspective, valued through the lens of the physical integrity as opposed to its business model, operating model contribution. And here it's relatively easy to do because we can identify the possible things that could go wrong, those things that must go right. We're living in the world here of more measurable uncertainties. Measurable uncertainties tend to go between a figure, between 0 and 1 type of stuff. Consequently, they're insurable. Stuff up here, high, medium, low type stuff that's uninsurable. And so I'm getting near the end just now, but again, sharing the idea that value perceived here is different in context to value perceived here. And it changes in value given situations. For example, two farmers, if you can imagine two being sold at the same time, broadly same activities, same geography, blah, blah, blah. One has poor, let's say, quality or let's say quality or safety records, the other has premium quality and safety records. These are things which kind of traditionally would reside in the value preservation space, quality and safety and all of that kind of stuff. But if one has a very good track record in that regard, and the other has a not so good, the one with a good track record is going to get a premium attached, potentially, to its valuation on sale, on divestiture. If it doesn't get a premium, one thing's for sure, the facility, the folk within it, the machinery within it, that's experiencing a poorer track record, it for sure is going to get a discount. So in that particular context, at a point of divestiture, things were traditionally that were regarded as kind of value preservation practices, all of a sudden now have a value creation contribution, just because of context. It's kind of yin and yang. Okay, so this then, just in this kind of last slide, or second last slide, I superimpose now on this x-axis these things, which some of the things that are reflected in the eyes of 37,000 governance of organizations. I say governance, I don't say corporate governance. Corporate governance is about board compositions, frequency of meetings, diversity, minutes. Governance, as distinct from corporate governance, is a legal thing, a legal construct. Governance is all about knowing where we're going. It's about direction. It's about steering. The etymology of the word governance is to steer. Back in the days when the early Greeks, Hellenic Greeks, steering their ships, they knew where they were, weren't quite sure where they were going to, because they had no GPS back in those days. It's all about the stars, the moon, currents, and wind, trade winds, and so forth. So things like purpose, things like data as an asset and decisions, things like strategies and how you can deploy them, small but often, being agile, the business model, understanding, being able to hold a business model conversation, and the outcomes, different mix, the strengthened mix of capitals at the end of every kind of strategic initiative, and so forth. So these are the ideas that I wanted to share. And at the very end of this slide here, I've got some references here, and also in particular here, Chief Value Officer, Accountants Can Save the Planet, for those of us that are accountants in the room, written by a dear friend of mine, Professor Mervyn King, who's a founding patron of an organization called the ESG Exchange, of which I'm chairman of the technical committee. And we're a collaboration between the ESG standard setters and regulators, producing these how-to playbooks that are derived from the standard setters and ultimately edited by industry through a particular approach we have. And that will be launched formally, already launched, but it'll be launched formally later in the year when the first books begin to to come out. And in many respects, the ESG exchange is kind of a living testament to some of the thinking, quite a lot of the thinking that's inherent in the slides that I've shared with you. And really, there's no new thinking in any of this. Really, it's a case of just representing and reshaping stuff that's already known, proven, and accepted, except applied differently in a different context of a world that's growing in uncertainty.